The morning of September 4th, 2025 will be remembered like a thunderclap. In a single Council of Ministers meeting, Captain Ibrahim Traoré didn't just shuffle his cabinet, he detonated the foundations of a system built on fraud. 21 high-ranking officials, men and women who for years sat in offices of power, were exposed as imposters. Their diplomas were fake. Their credentials were fabricated. And yet for years they had signed off on budgets, guided infrastructure, designed school curricula, and overseen national health, all without the knowledge, training, or legitimacy to do so. It was more than shocking news. It was a betrayal. A betrayal of every young Burkinabe who studied late into the night, every mother who sold grain to pay her child's school fees, every honest graduate who lined up for a job interview only to be pushed aside by someone with connections and counterfeit papers. That morning, Traoré drew a line in the sand. He dismissed them on the spot, no severance, no ceremony, and he made the names public. The message was clear. The era of false promises and stolen opportunities was over. This was not simply about fake diplomas. This was about the soul of a nation and perhaps the future of an entire continent. But here is the question. Will this spark remain within Burkina Faso, or will it ignite a continental fire? If Traoré has the courage to demand real qualifications, will Nigeria, Ghana, Ivory Coast, and yes, even the wider African Union follow? Or will they hide behind silence, afraid of the scandals that a genuine audit might unleash? Brothers and sisters, stay with us. Because what you're about to see is not just another news cycle. It is the beginning of Africa's war on fraud, a movement that could shape the destiny of generations to come. Do you believe that leaders should be chosen for their competence, not their connections? Comment verified excellence below. And if you want to stand with those who refuse to bow to corruption, share this video and subscribe. Because the truth deserves more than silence. September 4th, 2025, Ouagadougou. Inside the Council of Ministers chamber, a silence fell before the storm. President Ibrahim Traoré rose holding in his hand a dossier thick with evidence. What he revealed that morning would ripple far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. The findings of a months-long investigation were damning. 21 high-ranking officials in the Burkinabe government had secured their positions using fake diplomas. These were not minor clerks or low-level administrators. They were directors of ministries, advisors on infrastructure, financial planners, health administrators, and even education officials responsible for shaping the future of the nation's children. Each had built a career on lies. For years, they had signed critical documents, approved budgets, and issued policies, all without the education or expertise their roles demanded. An engineer who had never studied engineering oversaw bridges and roads. A health administrator with no medical background directed clinics and vaccination programs. An economic planner without a single finance course under his belt drafted national budgets that affected millions of citizens. And perhaps the most painful, education directors without training in pedagogy designed the curricula that millions of young Burkinabe followed in schools. The impact was devastating. Decisions that shaped the lives of ordinary people were made by individuals who lacked the very foundation of competence. Bridges collapsed not just from poor concrete, but from poor knowledge. Hospitals lacked essential supplies, not because the people did not care, but because those in charge did not know how to manage a health system. Economic planning faltered, leaving families to endure inflation and shortages. Decades of development were not just slowed, they were sabotaged. When Traoré spoke, he did not use flowery words. His announcement was blunt, direct, and unprecedented. All 21 officials were immediately dismissed. No severance packages, no quiet resignations, no backroom deals. Their names and positions were made public in a move designed to restore trust and demonstrate transparency. And the purge did not stop at dismissal. Criminal investigations were launched for fraud and forgery. Assets belonging to the disgraced officials were frozen pending inquiries into possible financial corruption. Every major decision signed under their authority was placed under review to safeguard the public interest. Government spokesman Pingdwenda Gilbert Ouedraogo addressed the press. These decisions are in line with the objectives of the popular progressive revolution. We will not tolerate fraud in any form. Every citizen must know competence, not connections, will define the future of this nation. Behind this bold action was a comprehensive verification system that had quietly been unfolding for months. Traoré ordered a full audit of the academic credentials of all senior officials. The verification process was thorough direct contact with universities, cross-checking graduation records, and exposing fraudulent institutions known as degree mills. Investigators traced suspicious diplomas back to networks spanning West Africa and even to fake accreditation bodies in Europe and the United States. The findings were staggering. The dismissed officials had operated under fraudulent identities for years, some even decades. Their counterfeit documents had slipped past weak verification systems, corrupt human resources officers who accepted bribes, and political appointments that bypassed normal procedures. The rot was deep, but now it was being excised. For the Burkina Faso people, the shock was mixed with vindication. For years, citizens had whispered about incompetence in government offices. Why were roads never finished? Why did school programs fail? Why did national budgets collapse under basic scrutiny? Now they had an answer. The wrong people had been in charge, and they were never qualified to lead in the first place. This purge was not just about individual guilt, it was about a system. A system where merit had been replaced by manipulation. A system where power was inherited through political connections, not earned through study or service. Traoré's decision to expose the 21 officials was the first hammer strike against that rotten structure. But the president was clear this was only the beginning. Every official's credentials, past and present, would be reviewed. Every diploma would be verified. Every fraudster, no matter how powerful, would be exposed. And the people were invited to watch every step, for the names would not be hidden. By the end of that day, a message had traveled across Burkina Faso and into the wider world. The age of fake diplomas was over. The standard had been set. The government would be run not by those who could pay or forge their way into office, but by those who had the education, expertise, and integrity to truly serve. The dismissal of 21 officials was only the opening act. Within days, the real scope of the crisis began to unfold, and the atmosphere across West Africa turned from shock to sheer panic. What Ibrahim Traoré revealed on September 4th was not an isolated scandal, it was a symptom of a disease infecting an entire continent. The Great Diploma Scandal. Investigators traced the fraud to an extensive network of more than 200 so-called universities scattered across Ghana, Nigeria, Benin, and Togo. These were nothing more than diploma mills selling certificates for prices ranging from $500 to $5,000. Some operated entirely online with polished websites and fake accreditation seals. Others relied on corrupt officials inside legitimate universities who, for the right price, produced transcripts and graduation records that looked real. Experts estimated that over 500,000 fake diplomas were circulating within West Africa, many already embedded in government offices, banks, hospitals, and schools. The reaction was explosive. In Nigeria, whispers turned into headlines. Independent journalists suggested that as many as 10,000 federal officials might be holding fraudulent degrees. Governors quietly ordered internal audits, while opposition leaders seized the moment, demanding that every minister face a credential review. Fear gripped Abuja. What would happen if Traoré's model of verification crossed the border? In Ghana, the scandal was no longer deniable. Parliament convened an emergency session. A special committee was formed to investigate educational fraud in public service. Universities received thousands of verification requests in a matter of days, overwhelming their offices. For the first time in decades, the very foundation of who was qualified to lead the nation was under open scrutiny. Ivory Coast reacted with barely concealed dread. Ministries scrambled as preliminary audits revealed suspicious diplomas among top officials. Rumors swirled of senior figures preparing to resign quietly before the scandal reached them. In Senegal, overwhelmed university systems faced a flood of demands to confirm or deny credentials. Mali saw an exodus of nervous bureaucrats, some disappearing entirely to avoid the fate of Burkina Faso's purged elite. The ripple effect was undeniable. Traoré's crackdown was no longer just a national purge, it had become a continental alarm bell. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens reacted with a mix of outrage and empowerment. Social media erupted. Hashtags like #NoFakeDiplomas and African Excellence trended with tens of millions of engagements. University students across Africa took to the streets, demanding that their governments adopt Burkina Faso's model of verification. If Traoré can clean his house, one student leader in Lagos declared, "Why can't ours?" The crescendo built further when international institutions responded. France expressed concern that Burkina Faso's approach was too radical, warning it might destabilize governance. The World Bank and IMF, long accustomed to working with pliable officials, cautioned against disrupting established systems. The European Union urged a gradual transition to preserve partnerships. The United Nations issued a careful statement about the need for balance in anti-corruption reforms. But beneath their diplomatic language lay a real fear. Competent, verified African governments are far harder to manipulate. A minister with a genuine economics degree is less likely to sign a predatory loan. An engineer who actually studied engineering won't approve a shoddy foreign contract. A health administrator with real medical training won't allow international agencies to dictate policy without question. The Western discomfort was palpable. At home, the mood was different. For the first time in living memory, Burkina Faso citizens saw the promise of a government that was competent because it was qualified. The purge of 21 officials became a symbol. Crowds in Ouagadougou cheered when the names were published. Radio hosts called it a second independence. On university campuses, students held up their diplomas proudly chanting, "Real degrees, real future." The climax of this chapter was clear. Traoré had thrown a stone into still waters, and the waves were racing outward. He had exposed a rot so widespread it could topple entire governments if fully revealed. And yet, instead of recoiling, he leaned into the storm. His stance was firm: no more fraud, no more lies. Africa deserves qualified leadership. It was no longer just about Burkina Faso. It was about the integrity of an entire continent's future. And in that moment, the purge became a movement terrifying the corrupt, inspiring the youth, and shaking international corridors of power. The purge of September 4th did not end with the humiliation of 21 disgraced officials. It triggered a deeper reckoning within Burkina Faso, one that touched ordinary citizens, reshaped political culture, and began to redefine what leadership meant on the African continent. For decades, the real casualties of fake diplomas were not only the taxpayers who paid for bad governance, but the thousands of honest Burkinabe who were denied opportunities. Graduates who had spent years studying by candlelight, women who had fought through gender bias to earn their degrees, and rural youth who scraped together tuition money, all were sidelined, while fraudsters advanced on the strength of counterfeit papers. Traoré's purge validated their frustration. It gave voice to the quiet anger of a generation who had seen incompetence rewarded and integrity punished. Within weeks, new officials were appointed to replace the dismissed ones. But this time, the process was different. Only candidates with verified qualifications were considered. Junior staff who had long been ignored suddenly found themselves promoted, their hard-earned degrees finally recognized. Diaspora professionals, engineers, doctors, economists answered the government's call to return home and serve. The difference was immediate. Policy drafts became more rigorous, infrastructure plans more realistic, and budget allocations more precise. For the first time, many citizens could see the visible link between competence and results. Trust in government, long eroded by decades of corruption, began to recover. People noticed when road projects were completed on schedule. They felt it when medical supplies reached clinics without disappearing into black markets. They saw it when school programs were updated by educators who actually understood pedagogy. Citizens began to believe that perhaps this time public service was not a dead end but a dignified calling. In a society where cynicism had been the norm, the purge planted the seeds of hope. But the purge also carried political risks. By exposing the rot, Traoré alienated powerful networks that had benefited from the status quo. Former ministers and their allies whispered of authoritarian excess. Opposition figures accused him of weaponizing anti-corruption to consolidate power. Yet their voices struggled to gain traction because the public could see the improvements with their own eyes. For ordinary Burkinabe, the debate was simple: better roads, better hospitals, better schools delivered by leaders who were actually trained to do the job. This was not just about education. Simultaneous investigations uncovered ghost employees siphoning millions from state payrolls, inflated contracts handed to political allies, and luxury fleets disguised as official transport. Over $127 million in misappropriated funds were identified and frozen. Seized assets, mansions, cars, bank accounts were publicly listed, reinforcing the sense that stolen wealth was finally being returned to the people. For once, anti-corruption was not just rhetoric, it was measurable, visible, and public. Perhaps the most profound consequence was cultural. Young people began to imagine a future where public service was earned through merit, not bought through corruption. Women once pushed aside were being appointed to leadership positions based on objective qualifications. Rural candidates found scholarship programs designed to level the playing field. Meritocracy was no longer a slogan, it was becoming a lived reality. The civil and political consequences of Traoré's purge were clear. A nation once weakened by fraud was being reforged in the fire of competence. It was painful. It was disruptive. But for many, it was also liberating. And as Burkina Faso transformed, a larger question loomed: could the same revolution sweep across Africa, or would entrenched elites find a way to smother it before it spread? When the purge in Burkina Faso made global headlines, the world reacted with unease. To many in the West, the removal of 21 high-ranking officials for fake diplomas was not just a domestic scandal, it was a geopolitical shock. Suddenly, a small, landlocked nation had exposed a truth that powerful countries preferred to keep hidden. Africa was no longer willing to tolerate incompetence, even if that incompetence served foreign interests. In Washington, policymakers watched Traoré's purge with mixed emotions. On the one hand, the U.S. State Department publicly praised Burkina Faso's anti-corruption drive, framing it as a step toward good governance. Yet behind closed doors, analysts worried. A government staffed by genuinely competent ministers and technocrats would be harder to pressure, harder to manipulate, and far more assertive in international negotiations. An economist trained in finance would not sign away national budgets under unfair IMF conditions. A health administrator with medical expertise would resist donor-driven programs that failed local needs. For American corporations accustomed to cutting deals with pliable or corrupt officials, this new standard posed a serious challenge. The European Union echoed similar concerns. Brussels urged gradual reform, warning that sudden purges could destabilize institutions. But many Africans heard a different message. Europe feared the loss of influence. After all, a Burkina Faso run by qualified professionals would negotiate trade and resource agreements with sharper eyes and firmer backbones. France, in particular, felt threatened. Long reliant on compliant Francophone elites, Paris suddenly faced a Burkinabe administration that not only demanded transparency, but also inspired neighboring nations to consider the same path. The shockwaves were not confined to the West. In Nigeria, Ghana, and Ivory Coast, the fear of similar purges pushed governments into defensive mode. Some quietly began verifying their own officials' credentials, hoping to avoid public scandal. Others tried to dismiss the Burkina Faso purge as a political stunt, but the youth in their countries were not convinced. Students on campuses in Accra, Lagos, and Abidjan shared hashtags like no fake diplomas and demanded their leaders follow Traoré's example. The pressure was no longer external, it was domestic, grassroots, and unstoppable. Multinational companies operating in Africa were among the most unsettled. For decades, weak governance had been their silent ally, allowing them to secure favorable contracts, skirt environmental regulations, and exploit labor. Now, with competent officials in charge, these practices faced scrutiny. Mining executives worried about renegotiated agreements. Agribusiness giants feared stronger labor protections. Western lobbyists pushed their governments to intervene diplomatically, arguing that Burkina Faso's reforms threatened business stability. In reality, they feared the end of easy exploitation. For older Americans watching from afar, the scandal struck a chord. What would happen if such a purge were conducted in the U.S.? What if senators, governors, or CEOs were suddenly forced to prove their qualifications under the same scrutiny? The question was unsettling, and it gave the Burkina Faso purge a resonance far beyond Africa. It wasn't just about one country's fight against fake diplomas, it was about the universal demand for integrity. The world's reaction revealed the truth. Competent African governments are not simply a domestic matter. They are a global disruption. They change trade, investment, and diplomacy. They shift power away from old centers of control and toward a continent rising on its own terms. That is why Traoré's purge is not only feared in African capitals, but also in Washington, Paris, and Brussels. Because if Africa demands real qualifications from its leaders, the world will have to meet Africa as an equal, not as a subordinate. September 4, 2025 was more than a date on the calendar, it was a turning point. On that morning, Ibrahim Traoré did not simply fire 21 corrupt officials, he shattered a culture of impunity that had poisoned Burkina Faso for decades and sent a message to the entire continent: fraud will no longer be tolerated. But the battle is far from over. If 21 officials in one small nation could operate for years with fake diplomas, what does that say about the hidden networks elsewhere? How many bridges collapsed because an engineer never studied engineering? How many hospitals failed because administrators had never set foot in medical school? How many billions were wasted because planners lacked even the basics of economics? The scandal in Burkina Faso is not the exception. It is the mirror of a continental sickness. And yet this moment also carries extraordinary promise. By daring to act, Traore proved that an African leader can hold the line, can demand real qualifications, can say no to the culture of shortcuts and stolen opportunities. His example is already echoing in Ghana, Nigeria, Ivory Coast, and beyond. Students are mobilizing. Citizens are demanding audits. Governments are under pressure to follow suit. For America and the wider world, there is both a lesson and a warning. A competent Africa is not a weak partner to be managed, it is a sovereign force to be respected. Western powers may fear this, but for ordinary people both in Africa and abroad, it should be cause for celebration. Because when officials are truly qualified, policies improve, corruption shrinks, and societies prosper. Brothers and sisters, this is the choice before us: continue tolerating fraud or embrace a future built on verified excellence. Which path do you believe Africa should take? Should leaders like President Ibrahim Traoré stand alone, or should this revolution spread across the continent? And for those of us watching from America, can we continue to trust President Ibrahim Traoré's reforms, or should we prepare to support someone else to carry the torch if he falls? If you believe that Africa deserves leaders with real qualifications, write verified excellence in the comments. Please share if you feel you are among the first to know about and support President Ibrahim Traoré. And subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines, because together we can keep this conversation alive and hold every leader accountable to the people they serve. The purge of 21 officials was not the end. It was the beginning. The question now is, will Africa rise to the standard that has finally been set?